Right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this session here in the seminar tent, where we're going to talk a little bit about the independent research behind delivering actual sort of regen agronomy on farm and the transition on commercial scale farms and operations. My name's Will Vaughan-France. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a regional agronomist with NIAB in the southwest. I also do a little bit of farming myself down there, small arable farm, 350 acres, which is very much a part-time business for me. And I'm joined by Ruth, who is a research fellow from the University of Leeds. Who is going to talk about a specific project that the University of Leeds and NIAB have been working on. So let's kick off then. So it had quite a long title about the importance of independent research in delivering effective regen agronomy on farm. So I've slightly butchered it in the title you see up there, being a little bit shorter. With a bit of luck, my voice will hold out. Monday this week, I couldn't actually speak with tonsillitis. I seem to be doing okay at the moment, so with a bit of luck, we'll get through the next 25 minutes. So what I wanted to first start off with is a bit of the sort of context in which we're operating from. If you're thinking about the transition from, say, a conventional operating system in towards regen, there's quite a lot of factors affecting change in particularly in arable businesses, but also in livestock ones as well at the moment. Some of those are very immediate economic challenges. Some of them have been around supply of inputs. So, for example, of availability and supply of fertilizers, the volatility in commodity markets, the prospects of what were pretty high profitability out of the last year's crop, but out of this coming year's crop are pretty moderate levels of profitability. Changes in legislation around, for example, particularly ammonia losses, continuing build-up of resistance, weeds, pests and diseases, and the way that climate is changing such that we are seeing different problems come into being more strongly from year to year. All those long-term challenges that actually often are the short-term ones as well, but build over the longer term, particularly around climate, and particularly around what has been for quite a long time quite slow productivity gains on farm. And by that, what I mean is the rate at which we turn inputs into outputs. So I'm not talking so much there about just yield increase, but actually that we're still having to use a lot of input to try and just stand still. You go through into areas of policy. I think Janet Hughes has just been talking about SFI again. So SFI is a big part of that, net zero, the opportunities that are available with land now to derive income sources that go beyond just conventional cropping, particularly in biodiversity net gain, nutrient neutrality, natural capital. All of these might have an effect on how we go about managing crops on farm, because we're having to think, instead of just about a crop income stream, we're having to think about perhaps multiple outputs. Through then into also new technologies coming in as well, some of which may have a more open door than others. Some may be longer term in areas like robotics, in gene editing, but also in biological areas, better understanding of the biology behind systems within soil, for example, that might lead us to improved ways of utilising those. It's quite a lot of complicated different drivers going on at the moment. We've also got this sort of term, regen agriculture, which we then have to try and work out what does it actually really mean in this context. So, the standard sort of 5 principles, which I'm fairly comfortable with, of keeping soil surface covered, limiting soil disturbance, having diversity in rotations, maintaining living roots, and the role of grazing livestock as well. All of which actually are things which would have been done on farms for a very, very long time. Not necessarily individually new, but in the way we might put them together might require us to think differently and make decisions in a different way from how we've been making them to date. I do wonder, though, how it is that such ideas could actually be seen in any way as being controversial, as they appear to be. I mean, grazing livestock, there's nothing controversial there, is there? A crop rotation? Is that controversial? The idea of having roots growing in soil, I mean, all of these things are ideas that aren't particularly controversial. So why is it then that some of the ideas of regen actually are difficult to take up on farm? Why is it that the term is not actually used to describe everyone's farming. And so what is it that's actually the barriers to taking some of this up? And therefore, what do we need to think about in the research we're doing and having some independent information to actually guide people through that? This isn't a preference order. I've put these things up. It's a bit of a random order of some of what I consider as the barriers to the uptake of regenerative agriculture principles, or at least bringing them all together in a consistent way. So a big one about uncertainty for the future. That's uncertainty in a policy landscape, uncertainty in an economic landscape. So actually an instinct on a need on some farms to think, well, how do I get through the next year, rather than worrying quite so much about, well, I'll worry about 5 years' time when I know whether I'm still here next year. Financial constraints is a part of that. Can I afford for something to go wrong whilst I'm having a system change or a transition? What is the policy landscape going to be? How many times will we see things reinvented before we know really where we are post BPS? What will we be incentivized to do? What will we be paid to do? The difficulty and challenge around land occupation structures. So it would be legitimate for any of you to ask me, and so I'll put it in there first, as to why I'm not doing all of those principles on my own farm at the moment. Well, I've got short-term land agreements, and in theory I could lose much of the land within the next 12 months if the landowner changed the way they want to operate. Makes it very difficult then to invest in a business accordingly. You have to focus on what you can do to deal with the next year. Short-term survival versus long-term investment, so that's part of it. Are you investing for a long-term return is fine, but only if you're getting a short-term return to stay in business. Confidence that change will work. Perceptions around land suitability, in particular when it comes to things like no-till, as to whether some farms it's just easier to do than it is on others. Doesn't mean it's impossible to do on the more difficult ones, but it's more challenging. Agronomic challenges that come from that, the availability of the right advice and information, and then this sort of confusion, what even is it, and a sense for some of, do I even need to change? Is what I'm doing broken? And I'm not sure that everybody would see that the system they're currently using could, maybe isn't quite fit for the future. One of the things that's quite significant, though, to the barrier to and you want to take up new ideas is this concept. Some of you might be aware of this, particularly if you've read a lot of Simon Sinek's work on particular things like cultural change, for example. But this applies with cultures, it applies with technologies, it applies with any sort of change of idea, product into a marketplace, that there is a barrier. There are barriers to the uptake of ideas reflected in the law of diffusion of innovation. It's a fairly reasonably well understood. It's a bell curve of a population, and you have the most people sitting in either the early majority, which is one standard deviation to one side of the centre, or the other side, the late majority. That's where most people are. That's where the mass market is. But you can't get an idea or a system or a culture put straight into that majority until it's first been through these earlier stages. So you've got innovators in a sector who will just jump straight into it. They'll totally get it. They'll believe it. They don't really need a lot of support to do it. They don't need lots of information and research to do it. They just will believe in it and get on and do it. And we see a lot of that, I think, in the regen, just sort of people who are very, very keen, really believe in it and get on and just do it. And then we have more sort of early adopters. These are people who, if they were looking to buy the latest iPhone, would at least wait for the queue to die down first and not be there queuing before the shops open. These are people who need a little bit more evidence. They don't want to quite be first, but they're keen to get going. They'll be more experimental in how they go about deploying a new system and trying something out. The need for they'll do trial and error. They'll develop that way. But there is a chasm that occurs later in this, where it's much harder to get the later people in this early adopters. So you get the first 10% quite easily, but getting an idea up to 18%, which is what you need to do before it can flip into the majority, is tricky, and it's crossing that chasm. And that's where I think a lot of the need for information, independent information and research is quite important to help guide those people who are needing a bit more information and support in the idea before they will move into some of the practices. Once they will do so, it's much easier to move. Everybody else will start to follow, and you start to see a whole-scale sort of system change. You certainly don't go for the laggards at the end. I think I remember Simon Sinek describing these are the people who, if the only reason they don't buy rotary dial telephones is because you can no longer get them. That's not the target market. You focus on the early adopters. Then there's this thing about what actually is independent. I thought, well, I'll have a look in this research in this title, and looked in the dictionary and thought, let's see what independent actually means. And there's quite a lot of definitions offered there, most of which make absolutely no sense in this context. So a few from the Cambridge Dictionary. The Oxford English Dictionary charges, so I use the Cambridge Dictionary. So this is it independent even, as I'm being asked? Not influenced or controlled in any way but by other people, events or things was about as close as I could find, or not involved in a situation so able to judge it fairly. I didn't really feel, amongst the numerous definitions that were offered, most involved politics, that it was terribly helpful. So to me it was actually to not have a vested interest in the outcome. So you're worried about being able to show that you're finding the outcome of what works and what doesn't work, but you're not trying to find a certain outcome at the outset. A focus on the end user of the research, so actually what is going to be useful for somebody to use, and to retain objectivity and not prejudge outcomes. That's not quite the same as being, say, sort of fair-minded. It's objectivity is the search for what you think might be right, even if it's inconvenient to what you might believe yourself. So also we did a bit of work about 12 months ago, and we asked our membership for our agronomy sort of information service, which reflects people who, some would consider themselves on a regen pathway, some will not at all consider themselves, and some would be interested. All sorts of different types of grower are reflected. And we asked them specifically about a number of topics that are gathering more momentum and more talk, but around which there's less clarity. How interested they were in more information on these topics, to gauge an idea of, if we go and talk about these things to a room of people, are they interested or are they immediately going to turn off? And what we found with these, and many of these topics will relate in some way to regen in some of their findings, so something like biostimulant use, overwhelmingly interested, novel fertilizers, companion cropping, digital agriculture, perhaps a little bit more tenuous, soil carbon. There wasn't really anything other than, funnily enough, integrating arable and livestock that had less, that generally wasn't so interested. And even that was only a third of people less interested, which suggests probably that the audience by and large don't have livestock. Grassland, which was less positive, but that reflects perhaps a less of a grassland audience. But you look at the level of interest there was in non-chemical weed, non-chemical disease, non-chemical insect control. Almost nobody wasn't interested in that. Doesn't matter what type of farming they were doing, this was of ubiquitous interest. The same with nutrient use efficiency. So there's quite a lot of commonality in what we're actually looking for. And you'll see in Ruth's talk a survey that was done of people who were focused on regen and how they responded, and there are some subtle differences, but there are some areas where it doesn't matter how you farm, you're interested in some of the same things. We also looked at then how farmers make decisions, because if you're going to produce research that's going to help guide them through a transition in regen, you have to understand whether the decision's being made by the grower or the agronomist. And this was sort of quite interesting, because we spent a lot of time talking about topics that actually agronomists influence farmers over and make the decision either with or on behalf of them. But there are a couple of areas where actually the control is much more within the farm for the decision-making process. That was things like variety choice, soil management, cultivations, policy, crop rotation, all of which are quite intrinsic to delivering effective sort of regen management on farms. So it's making sure actually those things are being talked about and the research and information there is coming to the right people there, rather than going to the people who actually aren't making the decision in that one. Overwhelmingly, members were asking us for more information on soils, on regenerative farming, also these are words that people put in free text into this question of what additional areas are you wanting information on, and there was virtually nothing there that actually doesn't in some way relate to regen, which I think shows you such a broad topic, and the interest level is there again regardless of the type of farming. The areas which they were finding most challenging were interesting. This was focused principally, weed control was the big topic which growers are finding challenging. It didn't seem to matter where they came from, what type of farm, but some of our colleagues who specialise in weeds, Will Smith and John Cussons, who might be known to you, are at least pleased because their careers are pretty safe. Everybody else is probably a little bit more worried now as to whether there are actually any other problems on farm. And certainly these are perhaps perceived as some of the biggest barriers to the uptake of some of the regen concepts: cover cropping, no-till, minimal soil disturbances, managing some of these issues with weeds. I'm going to skip over that. So how do we make decisions on farm as well? Because if you're going to look at some of the barriers to it, you've also got to consider how people make decisions. And so how does information need to reach them? Well, I just pulled out an example here of some of the factors, the sources of information that are going into my mind when I make a decision on my farm. And you can see there's quite a lot there. And it'll be the similar or slightly different lists with different weightings for different people. There's a big part of it's personal experience, peer experience. A big part of it is how you've been trained, how you've been taught, who your agronomist is, how your relationship extends with them, other advisors that maybe are selling something to you, advisors who maybe aren't selling something to you, what you read in the media, what you see and speak to, people you hear and speak to when you come to events like this, academic work, trials work. There's lots of different parts, and that could just be over deciding whether to put a fungicide on something or not. Lots of that you won't be aware that you're using in making a decision. You don't consciously think, well, what was it I read in an article the other day? But all of these bits of information are feeding through into what you may or may not have confidence to do. So what we're thinking about when it comes to independent information here is being able to provide a source of information that sort of is a fairly stable one here, it hasn't got an emotional viewpoint as many of these others do, and that's fine, but has something that's less emotional that can give you a more sort of stable and consistent answer as part of that can feed in then to that decision making. And so we've then got a problem that we are thinking about things in a very multi-factor sort of way rather than a simple solution. So you haven't got a simple answer to a simple question now. You've got quite complicated answers when you start to think as a systems approach in more of a regenerative, perhaps, way. So the simple answer to factors in disease control in winter wheat was, I have a disease, I'll apply a fungicide. That would be a very simple way of looking at it. Or there's, if you're trying to think about how you manage it as part of a whole system, you come into a much, much more complex, interactive set of factors here. And this is then why I think the importance of research into farm systems. So it's independent research is having to shift what it focuses on from just which fungicide is better than another fungicide to the way that farm systems interact, because it's much more nuanced, much more complicated when you've got lots of factors that might each contribute 5% to the answer to a question. So we're starting to see much more in the work we're doing. We're starting to see more strip trial work coming into it, starting to see more farm scale research. There's a couple of images here. We've still got the small plot work. Here's a small plot barley trial down in South Devon. Had to cut out the cliffs and the sea behind because that would distract you from that photo. But the one on the grazing trial was one on my own farm last year, just looking at how grazing might reduce the disease pressure within wheat. It made a big difference and very much in the favour of grazing and reducing the level of septoria in that wheat crop. Actually would be enough to be game changing probably in a season like this one if I'd done it again. In other systems work we're looking at, we've had a lot of work going on with the Morley Trust and New Farming Systems work in Suffolk as well, looking at how soils and land adapt to changes in farming systems, and trying to get an idea then of how how decisions can be made in those systems, how to actually transfer them and to deliver them onto farm. Long-term pieces of work looking at new farming systems. And an example of that you'll hear much more about in a moment from Ruth, who will talk about some of the work at Headley Hall, which is exactly trying to do this and go into in more detail. I'll just go back a couple of slides to say, so there's a few other things we're doing, for example, with the membership now, looking at different practices that different members are employing on farm. And this is a piece of research we wouldn't have done probably 5-10 years ago, who are going on farm, people who we know have different systems are going and analysing how those systems are delivering changes in soil health, in crop performance over time, and then reducing through the mass of data as to get trends on what systems are delivering what effects and what changes. So we're still doing small plot work that's relevant to that, but it's really more about the systems work now. So I'm actually going to pause there, and we're going to hand over to Ruth, who will talk a bit about the work that's being done at Headley Hall between the University of Leeds and NIAB. Over to you, Ruth.
Thank you, Will, and thank you everyone for coming, and for NIAB for inviting me to talk to you today. So as Will says, my name is Ruth Wade, and I'm from the University of Leeds, a research fellow in the School of Biology, and I'm also working with Lisa Collins, Steve Banwart, Pippa Chapman, who's also here today, and they're doing a hedgerow safari later if you want to join, and Giza Rice. So as a group of researchers, we're working, just to tell you a bit about us, we're working on a very large project called Fix Our Food, and it's funded by the UK government, a special pot of money looking at transforming UK food systems. And the project is a large collaborative project with many different stakeholders and research organisations involved, with an overarching aim to understand how to steward system transformation towards a regenerative food system. So this is a really large aim for a project. So it actually decided to focus on Yorkshire as an exemplar region, and from all the learnings that we gain from this project, we'll then build up to the rest of the UK and beyond. Like I said, it's a very large project with many different work packages. So they go from understanding the current food system through to like innovations, metrics, policies, and system integration and learning. So if you want to know more about the project, please visit the website Fix Our Food, and it'll tell you a lot more about the different activities going on, but also how you can get involved if you're interested in the project as well. But as part of the innovations of this project, there's a group looking at healthy eating for young children, hybrid food economies, and then a regenerative farming system, which the University of York, the University of Leeds is leading. University of York is leading the project. That's why it's just a blip there. So as the University of Leeds, we've got 4 key areas, activities that we're working on. So trying our best to understand the current system, particularly in Yorkshire, of the activities in regenerative agriculture that are already going on. Trying to understand how the university can support farmers interested in regenerative agriculture and also those that are already doing it. Providing evidence-based practice as a university. This is the topic of this talk is, key of providing independent evidence-based practice. And then there's no point in doing it unless we spend a lot of time sharing that information back and making sure that it's relevant for the stakeholders that need it. So for the talk today, I'm just going to focus on the work that we've been doing on evidence-based practice. And when we started this project, we really wanted any evidence-based practice that the university did to be relevant, important, provide information that people will really need. So we spent quite a lot of time going out to different farms locally, trying to understand what people are doing already on their farms, what they would like the university to do to support them, what practices they're using. We also had a survey, which is similar to, lots of people do with surveys, but this was really important for us to try and establish what practices are already being used and where we could provide evidence to back up what people are already doing. So we had 142 responses to our survey, many of which, as Will mentioned, said they were already regenerative farming. Over half were already using cover crops, direct drilling, increasing crop diversity into arable, reducing tillage, retaining crop residues. So this is really exciting that there's lots of people already doing lots of these practices. So really as a university, how can we support with evidencing the great work that's already being done? And as part of this survey, we also we asked many different questions. Don't have time to show them all today, but the other question that we were particularly interested in was the main challenges of moving towards regenerative agriculture as well, and how can the university support with evidence how best to move towards regenerative agriculture, or the quickest way to improve your soils, for example. And again, there was no real overriding consensus in this questionnaire question, but lack of good information on good practice came out top, lack of evidence, lack of financial support, reductions in yields, a big concern for a lot of people. And certainly when we went round farms to talk to lots of people about the challenges that they were facing, it's clearly evident there's lots of risks involved. So, poor seed germination and establishment in places where crop residues have been retained, or an understory out competing a cash crop just because of weather or timings. So as a group of researchers, after collating all this information, we're really sitting down thinking like, okay, how best can we support and provide evidence? And we really started realizing how big this challenge is as a researcher, because everyone is doing something different. There's lots of ways to reach the same end goal. Everyone's starting from a different point. Everyone's previous experience is different, and each year is different. And that's not even to add in that everyone's on a different soil type, they're farming in a different climate, the field and farm history is different, the farm context and business is different, rotation, equipment availability, timing, inputs and practices are all different, soil variability within field is different, but also between fields and farm. So these are huge problems for anyone trying to do any independent research project that's going to be helpful. And then just to add an extra complexity is how do we measure it, and what do we measure as well that's helpful for people. But despite these challenges, this is the whole point of a researcher, is to identify a way in which, with all of these different variables, can we come up with something that really tests these systems and provides helpful information. So at the University of Leeds, we're very lucky because we are one of the few universities still that has its own farm, which is conventionally business-led as well. So it's got the National Pig Unit. If you didn't know already, we have an indoor and outdoor pig herd, as well as a roughly 317-hectare commercial arable farm with permanent pastures in. We have Askham Bryan College. Their sheep graze the pastures. We have NIAB's Northern Powerhouse, as I hear it's called, sitting on the farm, which you rent fields from the university and do your own trials as well. And so this leads us to a great opportunity here, because we've got a commercial farm with excellent collaboration with NIAB, who have all the equipment, but also we have the ability to instrumentate any trial that we do here with all the facilities that the university has, and then we can back it up with all the university labs back at the main university site. With this farm, we chose one field that has been conventionally historically managed, so we're starting at a pretty low baseline here. And the aim was to demonstrate and measure the impacts of different transition strategies to regenerative agriculture. And the objective really is to measure the impacts on different combinations of practice on soil health, greenhouse gas emissions, crop production, and gross margins. Demonstration is really important, so we've already had lots of people come and look at the trial, and we're continually having more open days to come and look at the different practices and the measurements that we're taking, and also to determine which combinations are successful on our farm that hopefully we can then build up to the rest of the farm at a later stage. And so the trial itself, there's 7 different kind of farming systems, which I'll go through in my next slide. Each plot, there is a plot trial, but they're 12 meters by 40, so a very large plot trial. And this is to try and use as much commercial equipment as possible and have a good area so that we can really make as many measurements as we want to. And it is fully replicated as well. So all the 7 systems are replicated 3 times down the field in 3 different blocks. As you can see in the image, I was very excited to see that you can see our ploughed and no ploughed plots on Google Maps if you want to have a look. And obviously, Naya is a collaborator on this project doing the husbandry and work for us on the farm. Oh, sorry, that's why it's not working. Okay, so the treatments. So obviously we need a control, which is a conventional system. What we've determined as conventional is, so the plots were ploughed. They have a single variety of winter wheat, and all the nitrogen has come from the bag. And then we have the first maybe transition that people would take to more regenerative systems. So that's gone to a minimal cultivation and the addition of farmyard manure, which is from the pig unit, thank you. And then from then on, each treatment builds in complexity. So the third treatment we have has minimal cultivation, it has the addition of farmyard manure, but this time it has a mixed blend of winter wheats. And then the next one has minimal cultivation, farmyard manure, a mixed blend of winter wheats, and it was grazed with sheep earlier in the year. And then the final one to try and cover all the principles was minimal cultivation, farmyard manure, mixed blend of winter wheats. It was grazed earlier in the year, and we have a companion crop of legumes and herbs. And then we have 2 additional treatments that actually change the rotation. So both of which are in herbal lays at the moment, and that's a GS4 mix. But one of them will be go back into the arable rotation next year. And the thinking behind this was we know that lays have a huge impact on the soil on the university's farm. So we really wanted to know, what kind of gross margins you'd get following a herbal lay into the next year. So here's some drone footage of the trial earlier on in the year. And like I've said, this trial does indeed cover some of the issues that I was mentioning before, because we can compare 7 different systems with the same soil type, with the same climatic region, field history, starting point, and experience and timing. It also allows us to take very detailed measurements, which I'll explain on my next slide, because of the university's facilities and also because of its location. It can be replicated as well. So for a research project, we can do intensive statistics on this to make sure that what we're telling you is happening is a real finding. It's not just a spurious event, essentially, because that soil in that particular plot is slightly different. And we can really compare yield, time, and profit to each of those farming systems. So there's lots of benefits for doing it like this. However, there's no perfect answer to any of this independent evidence-based research, because this trial is in one farm, in one field, in one climate region, and one farmer, although there's many of us working on it. And it's only 7 systems. Now, 7 systems sounds a lot, and it's certainly a lot for me to manage, but even so, every day making the decisions on those 7 different systems is a nightmare, because everybody's doing something different, and we could do so many different options, and there's so many things we haven't been able to cover. But this is my ambition now, is to try and get this trial on other farms and other fields and other systems, and look at other ideas as well, because it is there's lots of benefits for doing it, and hopefully it will give us some important information. So for those interested in the agronomy, the soil is a sandy silt loam. The previous crop was oilseed rape. We spread farmyard manure late August last year, 25 tonnes per hectare. The conventional plots were ploughed and harrowed. The herbal lays and companion crops were broadcasted at the end of August. We grazed the wheat with sheep early in March. All the plots have had 220 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare, and we have calculated the farmyard manure in that as well. But all the plots have had the same nitrogen application, and I think this is something we'd like to experiment further with next year and try and reduce that and see how the different treatments fare. The wheat was drilled last year in October. The single variety is KWS Exitase. The blend is Exitase, Theodore, Saki and Graham, which NIAB showcased here this year, or it was last year? Okay. Yeah, last year. Okay. And like I said, the herbal lays, the Cotswolds GS4, and the companion crop we put in white clover, red clover, vetch, trefoil, plantain, and burnet. And yeah, like I said, NIAB are doing the agronomy and husbandry on the trial, and Ask and Brian, we borrowed their sheep, so I'm very grateful to them for collaborating with us on this project. So the types of measurements that we can do are really detailed. So we had, before we did anything, so the trial is only in its first year at the moment, but before we did anything, we took soil samples at least 3 places in every single plot, down to 50 centimetres deep. And at 10 centimetre intervals, we've done full soil assessment of chemical, physical properties. We did earthworm sampling a few months ago. We got sensors in from a company called Paultech, who are looking at measuring water availability and nutrient availability in the plots. But we also have our own sensors that are measuring soil moisture, water potential in all of the plots at different depths. We also have incredible opportunity to measure greenhouse gas emissions, and these kind of alien-looking things in the field here are actually automated greenhouse gas chambers. So they are timed to open and close throughout the day, throughout the year, and when they close, they're measuring greenhouse gas emissions, and then it'll open so that it's not a closed system all throughout the year. And I'll show you some preliminary data on that next. And the other great thing about these plots is that they're big enough that we've split them in half, so we can do soil and crop sampling in one area, and we keep one area completely undisturbed so that we can measure yield. I've got students measuring disease. We've obviously taking all the inputs so we can look at profit, and we'll be measuring yield at the end of it as well. So just looking quickly at some of the data we've already got. So this is from the greenhouse gas measurement chambers. And I want to really highlight why it's so important to have high frequency data on greenhouse gas emissions from plot trials like this. The red arrows show where we put nitrogen on the plot. The top graph is the N2O emissions. So this is nitrous oxide, the really potent greenhouse gas that can come from our agricultural fields. And what you can see is when we add nitrogen to our crop, a few days later, you get a release of N2O into the atmosphere. And then on the bottom graph here, we've got net ecosystem exchange, so that's carbon dioxide. And what is really clear here is the diurnal variation in greenhouse in CO2 emissions, because during the day you've got uptake of CO2 because of photosynthesis, and during the night you've got a release of of carbon dioxide because of respiration. And that's shown by the negative values is when CO2 is taken up because of photosynthesis, and the positive values of where it's being released because of respiration. And so it's so important that when we do these kind of trials, we're measuring high frequency greenhouse gas emissions, because they're changing throughout the day, throughout the season, depending on when you're putting products on. Before we had these chambers, you would have to take point measurements, which could give you, a different answer because of the timing that you went. So these are how the plots looked in December. So we've got conventional plot that's obviously been ploughed, and the minimal cultivation, which I've obviously got some residue from the oilseed rape and farmyard manure. And then the herbal lays, which you can see is much more cover, particularly compared to the conventional, if you're interested in keeping your soil covered, for example. And then in April, we've got conventional here on the left, minimal cultivation and sheep grazed in the middle, which you couldn't really tell much difference, and the herbal lay again, and so you're starting to see ground cover now between the three. And then this was last month, so you've got you can see now the greenhouse gas chambers as well, conventional on the left. In the middle, you've got the minimal cultivation, sheep graze and understory. So you can see the vetch has come up and is flowering above the crop, and the herbal lay on the right. And just really preliminary again, just looking at some NDVI images online. So NDVI gives you kind of a rough estimate of ground cover until essentially it starts saturating. And so really exciting that you can see in January, the herbal lay plots are so evidently clear that they've got so much more ground cover, and you can see that on the NDVI images. And then going through the year when we've grazed with sheep, the conventional treatment is showing up on the NDVI images having a greater ground cover. But now by April, you're not really seeing any difference. And June, I would really suggest that NDVI now is not really the most appropriate measure here now, because you've got a lot of ground cover. So, more biomass measurements probably would be more suitable now. How are we doing for time? So yeah, just to say that obviously there's lots of other ways in which you can do trials on your own farms, and we've got another trial, a split field trial at the university's farm, looking at a clover understory or without clover understory in an oilseed rape field, and that we'll try and keep that clover going throughout the number of rotations. But when we do trials like this, it's really important to make sure that there's no soil differences across the field, or how big is the field, and if there's patches that are normally wetter, or that there's soil differences, that you make sure you include that in the design, so that something that happens to the right of the field is actually due to the clover understory, and not because you've got a weird bit of soil in that side. And we already noticed that with the clover we saw less weed burden, but actually fewer oilseed rape plants. So really interesting to see when we harvest this, how this translates into yield. So yeah, just the final, thank you so much for all listening, and just to acknowledge the fact that this trial is very intensive and it requires a lot of staff and collaboration, both with technicians, NIAB, and farmers who have spent their time coming and giving us advice. So I'm extremely grateful to everyone who's helped our funding, and Ask and Brian College and Valcourt as well. So thank you so much for listening. I do update on our trial on Twitter when I can. So if you want to follow me, my Twitter handle is there if you're on Twitter. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ruth. I think we have probably a few minutes for some.
Yes,
if anybody wants to ask any questions, I think we have a few. There is a roving microphone. So if we come to the lady in the front here, Regen Farming.
I was going to ask, the manure that you put on the fields, what form does it take? Is it literally just manure, straight manure?
Yeah, so it's pig, muck and straw. Yeah.
And straw. Because I was going to say, if you put manure straight on the field, it's going to off-gas straight away. Isn't a better form possibly putting compost on, which will hold on to the nutrients better and give it into the soil?
Yeah, definitely a good idea. So yeah, it was straw and muck, definitely, which had already been left for 2 years. So it had already started to compost a bit. But no, I completely take your point. And again, this is the problem, is we could do so many other, it would be really great to look at different composts and the greenhouse gas emissions. I mean, the greenhouse gas emissions I showed there is not from the farmyard manure. The farmyard manure was applied in the autumn, and the data that I showed you there was in spring. So that's from nitrogen that we put down on the trial from the bag, essentially. But yeah, I mean, it'd be really interesting to look at different compostings and the impact of that on greenhouse gas emissions and soil health, definitely. Yeah.
Okay, we got any other questions? Yep, the gentleman over.
Thanks very much indeed. One of the issues that you don't see much published on is actually, and the one issue that many farmers are really concerned about, is the profitability picture. And you're clearly looking at the gross margins and should see some quite interesting comparative gross margins coming out of your exercise. When do you first publish those?
Oh, good question. So just Actually, on the gross margins thing, though, again, it's really interesting because next year I'd like to push the system more because we've put the same nitrogen on every single plot. You're talking about profit. It becomes so difficult because actually I suspect that the more regen probably we shouldn't be putting that much nitrogen on because you've got a legume there, and that would affect your profit. But these are all, there's so many different things we could measure and test, and I think we went for standard nitrogen application on everything for the first year because we didn't want to change too much and not be able to measure anything. But I think next year is the year to reduce everything and see the impact that has, and then and be able to look at profit on that way as well. The publishing thing, yes, research is very slow to publish things. I know where you're going with that. Because I find that sharing information on this is so important. You guys are already doing this. I've got a newsletter. We do have events, where I'm happy to share the research. like at this, when we've got that data, I don't see why we can't come here and present that to you, so you can get that data before we take a year to publish it. That's good to you?
I'll just add, if I may, as somebody who isn't a great fan of gross margins, not because I don't want to look at the financials, but because in talking about system change, it doesn't tell you that much, because it's dealing with a set of the costs, but it's actually ignoring often another set of quite important costs, which is how the operational structure of a business is changed when the way that cropping is changed or the whole system has changed. That if we fundamentally changed all the machinery basis that we're using, the labour profile of the business as a result, if we've invested in some other things as a result, it has it. So we've actually got to go further, what I call operating margin, which is where I like to go to when I'm looking at the sort of system change, to get an idea of how beyond just the variable costs, how it's affected the labour, the machinery profile, and the directly attributable fixed costs of the business. And I think it's something we should be doing quite routinely, because it's critical to working out whether these things really stack up and whether the investment stacks up.
Yeah, and just to follow on with that as well as the research, my background's in plant biology, but then I start talking to people about the impacts of doing some of these things, and then they start talking to me about drying costs and all of these downstream effects as well. And I'm very keen to make sure that we include, like you say, some of the...
Try not to ever model drying costs.
But there's a point here, isn't there, that, if we need to be aware of all the knock-on implications for these practices, and, can't just close our minds off to the implications of doing some of these.
Yeah. I think you have a question there, yes. Oh, right, yes, Edward.
I just wanted to ask what nitrogen sources you were using and whether you'd got any plans to use foliar nitrogen. I mean, nitrogen use efficiency is probably one of the top ones in the last couple of years. And, in my opinion, we ought to be looking at foliar nitrogen as it's sort of 90% efficient. And it wouldn't, it doesn't impact on the soil like ammonium nitrate does. I'm an advocate of urea, using urea. Joel Williams is here this year talking about, foliar nitrogen and nitrogen use efficiency.
Yeah, another really, really good point. We haven't used any foliar nitrogen, and it's something that would be really interesting to know about, particularly with the greenhouse gas emissions as well, and how that's impacted. Because I suspect, I need to do more work on that data, but I suspect what you're seeing is when it becomes wet, our pelleted nitrogen application, that's when all of our greenhouse gas emissions are coming off. So if you apply in a different way, what impact that has, I don't think we know. I mean, I haven't seen anything that we know yet on that. So, I mean, there's so many more things we could be testing. We even had some people talking about the different cultivation methods we've used as well. So it's just for us to now make a decision of what people are most interested in knowing next. But definitely, thank you for the suggestion, because I'll keep that in mind and think about how we can bring that into the trial.
Please note, is something we've got in quite a few NIAB membership trials as well at the moment, actually, is looking at how far you can take foliar nitrogen within a system, because quite clearly from a carbon footprint point of view, it's quite favourable. A nutrient efficiency point of view, it's a very favourable way of using it. So we have another question here.
Yes, two questions. The first is, Ruth, you've painted a great picture in terms of the level of complexity and variables there are in regenerative agriculture, and it's huge. And we're also very much at the beginning of the journey. So there is definitely an importance of getting research done. But how do you do it in a cost-effective way that doesn't take too long? And I've seen lots of large-scale businesses that source, let's say, one ingredient, primarily have launched their own research programs. So they work, let's say, with their suppliers, 2,000-3,000 people. And so they've been able to launch these research programs, let's say Nestle with coffee or AB InBev with barley, but they're not public. They're owned by the company, and that's where the results go. So I'm wondering, is there any large-scale research that you envision that is independent, that isn't, for example, one plot and looking in detail, but can actually reach out to thousands of farmers and gather the data of what they're doing on a day-to-day basis for us to learn about regen? So that's one question. And the second, just very briefly, out of the topics you've listed, nutrition doesn't come up. And I'm just wondering why the impact on nutrition of regen ag is not necessarily well researched at the moment.
Shall I go first? I've got to remember the first question.
I'll happily allow you to go first.
Yeah, the first question's already come from my mind. The nutrition thing is because we would like to look at nutrition. I've tried to engage with you know all this, but we've tried to engage with the nutrition researchers at the University of Leeds. But they do bring up the fact that when you cook anything from a regenerative trial, the nutrients, the levels of nutrients, the question is, once you've cooked it or processed it into something that we eat, will you maintain these nutritional values? And I don't know enough about this. It's something that you have a project to look at this, so it's a sneaky question. What was the first question? Oh yes, about research. Yeah. So yes, so there's lots of amazing things being done. So I know the Soil Association, for example, has done lots of soil sampling on different farms and different practices. I know ADAS has their yen competition. They're collecting lots of data, and I was thinking of somebody else now. But anyway, the key problem that this trial can solve is the greenhouse gas emissions, because at this point in time, we don't have any way of cheaply measuring greenhouse gas emissions that we need to in that level of detail. So that's a fundamental problem. There are other consortiums that have something called an eddy covariance tower. Actually, I think there's one here on the one of the stands at the show that they can put up, and then you would measure greenhouse gas emissions from the entire field, which is really great and is adding a lot of information to our knowledge and understanding. But it is only from one field, and you can't have treatments within that field because you don't know where those greenhouse gas emissions are coming from. So this is something that science needs to pull their finger out and find a way of measuring greenhouse gas emissions cheaply, that so we can get more data. But there are lots of organisations and groups. I was thinking of the Carbon Toolkit and those companies as well. I know they're doing lots of soil sampling and gathering lots of data that's very helpful for people to understand soil carbon. Yeah.
I haven't got a lot to add to that. I think one of the things I'll just say on the nutrition front that sort of interests me quite a bit on this is it's not something we really look at within the sort of work that I'm involved with and my colleagues at NIAB, but we have a marketplace that isn't paying for quality of nutrition. And so when you have a marketplace that isn't really paying for it, it's quite difficult to invest in and see a return. And I think it's a sad thing that there isn't a sort of nutritional differentiation in food, because I think that might do us all some good if there was accordingly. On the front of sort of larger scale research projects, the size of which you can go with a research project, I mean, there's a funding part to it, but it's also finding a group of people, a large enough group of people with a common interest. And in some market segments globally, that's probably easier to do than others. It might be that actually trying to get, say, 1,000 UK arable farmers to work collaboratively on something might be quite difficult But on the other hand, there are organisations that can overarch that could potentially do it. But it's going to depend if the demand is coming from the bottom up to do it, because there isn't unless you were to look at, say, government-based, there isn't really a sort of somebody else to drive that through. So I think it probably needs to come from the ground, and there are some formats where that could happen.
Yeah, it's a really good point about independent research and where the funding's coming from, because that is driving the research priorities as well. And so if you want something large scale like that, probably you'll have to come from government. And they actually do have a funding call out at the moment for land use change for net zero, or whatever it's called. But so hopefully that will fund some research, and they actually request in that landscape scale research. But there's going to be a few years before any of that comes out. But yeah, I mean, small businesses aren't necessarily going to fund large landscape scale research in that way.
We got
Oh, hello there. Jenny Phelps from the Farming and Wildlife Advisory Group. Really great session. Thank you so much. I was just interested in the sort of like the chart that you put up of all the different people that influence farmers, and I didn't see independent, free environmental farm advisors on there, because I'd like to think we make a little bit of a contribution.
I wouldn't wish to say that was an exclusive, unless there was a danger of the font getting too small.
That's absolutely fine. I was just saying that, please be aware there is a huge amount of work going on, free advice for farmers around about how to help them transition to regenerative agroecological farming. Most of it's actually being funded by environmental trusts, and it's quite nice because it's independent, so it gives people the time to explore the brain space around how this works for the complex things you've outlined today. But don't forget us, because we're trying to help too.
That's great. And actually, I have done a bit of work with some of your colleagues in the Southwest earlier this year, so with Joe O'Born and others. So yeah. Okay, I think we'll probably draw to a close there. So thank you very much, everyone, for listening. Thank you very much for Ruth for joining me on this, and well, enjoy the rest of your time here.